humanities and arts and education community, the wonderful, bright talent that this university has been hiring in recent times to make sure that the university continues to be a nationally ranked university and also to improve our academic profile. Today I have that pleasure. 10 years ago, David Merolla was completing his BA in sociology at Kent State University just 10 years ago, in 2003. So that the students who are here can take as a role model that if you do your work and pay attention to study activities, you can become, in 10 years, highly esteemed assistant professor in a major research university in this country. So 10 years ago, I graduated summa cum laude from Kent State University, which is a top university in this country. So pay attention. Then he went on to earn an MA from the same university in 2005. And then in 2010, he earned his PhD from that university. And during that time, he received a university fellowship, which is a distinguished honor. So the sociology department here at Wayne was very astute, and they grabbed him, recruited him, and now he is an assistant professor in our program here. His interest areas include racial disparities in education, social psychology, and quantitative methodology. He uses the quantitative methodology to investigate social inequity using the basic sociological premise that structural factors have substantial impact on individual lives and outcomes. To date, he has applied this idea to issues of race and ethnicity, to education and stratification beliefs. Since coming to Wayne State University in 2010, he has fulfilled his promise, has published articles in Sociological Perspectives, Social Psychology Quarterly, Journal of Pain and Symptom Management, the Canadian Journal of Criminology and Criminal Justice. All those things he's done in just a couple of years. Other research projects that he is involved with include a study of science college training programs and a study of using multi-level models to analyze factorial survey data. He was a Humanities Center resident scholar in the year 2011-2012. And in that capacity, he revealed an ability to read widely and deeply in areas that he is not working in. He was an extremely valuable colleague, contributed ideas every time we met, and I'm hoping that sometime in the not too distant future, he will come back and serve again in our center. But he has volunteered today, after his very, very busy schedule, to give a talk for us. His current research projects include a project that looks at the effect of wealth on educational achievement, and a project that investigates the role of identity on graduate school entry in science. So you're witnessing the beginning of a very, very promising academic career. And for that, I'm very pleased to welcome to the podium my young colleague, Professor David Merolla. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Walter. Thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to Jennifer and Nikki and the Humanities Center for making this all possible. So my title today is Reassessing the Role of Student Attitudes and Beliefs. For those of you who know me well, you'll be surprised to know that there is no quantitative analysis that I'll be doing today. There's one attached to this, but it's still in the works, so surprising, I know. Let's go ahead and get started. So, as most of us know, racial disparities, or the achievement gap between black and white students, remains one of the United States' most intractable social problems. Since the inception of nationhood, really, in the United States or even before, Black Americans have consistently obtained less education and education of a lower quality compared to their white counterparts. And recent statistics show that this continues today. So, for instance, currently, black students score about 26 points behind their white counterparts in both reading and math. And that 26-point disparity means that the average white 8th grade student currently outperforms the average black 12th grade student in both of these subjects. And this is from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, kind of the biggest national testing regime in high schools. Now, although our country's history, although our country's history of excluding non-white racial groups from education has been well documented, I argue that this history has also been integrated into a general sense among many Americans that we're making progress on the so-called race problem ever since the emancipation of slavery and through the civil rights movement in the 60s, all the way through the election of our first black president in 2008. Now this sense that we're making progress has led many to conclude that equality of opportunity exists, that we've achieved equality of opportunity in the United States. And a belief that we've achieved equality of opportunity leads many to attribute remaining socioeconomic and educational disparities between racial groups to the dispositional characteristics of black Americans themselves, rather than the structure of American society. And so this idea plays into this general sense of what's been called colorblind racism, or the idea that any sort of race-based social policy is inappropriate today because we're sort of race doesn't matter in the so-called post-racial era. Now, when we look at education specifically, this basic premise is embodied by what's called the oppositional culture perspective, made famous by an anthropologist named John Ogbu. This theory argues that the primary cause of minority underperformance is an oppositional culture among minority students that leads them to reject schooling as a path to status attainment. So we'll just go through this oppositional culture perspective. According to Ogbu, the most distal, or the furthest away factor affecting any minority group's experience is what's called their mode of incorporation into what he called the host society. He's very anthropological. And he distinguishes between what he calls voluntary and involuntary minority groups. Voluntary minority groups, sort of like immigrant minority groups, are groups that enter the country by choice and see the host society as offering an opportunity for a better life. Non-voluntary minority groups, or involuntary minority groups, are groups that became minority groups through colonization, conquest, or enslavement. And Ogbu argues that the mode of incorporation affects these groups in terms of both the system forces they confront and also shapes what's called their cultural frame of reference. So, from this theory, system forces refer to how groups are treated both by society generally and specifically within the educational institution. The theory argues that involuntary minority groups are more likely to face economic barriers which inhibit the acquisition of social capital and serve to reduce the benefits of educational attainment. So, for instance, lots of research shows that minority groups face employment discrimination, and Ogbu called this a job ceiling that limits their ability to obtain economic benefits commensurate to their education. And moreover, members of these groups often face nefarious stereotypes suggesting they are unable to learn and are naturally inferior to the dominant group. Voluntary and involuntary minority groups also differ in what he calls their cultural frame of reference. Voluntary or immigrant groups bring with them what's called a primary frame of reference from their original country. These groups import language and customs from their home country and tend to compare their social standing with those in their home country. Non-voluntary minority groups, on the other hand, are said to develop what he calls a secondary frame of reference. So rather than bring language and customs from an origin country, these groups develop language and customs in the host society which often center on a minority identity. In combination with discriminatory system forces, the secondary frame of reference has two effects. First, it produces more animosity towards the dominant society as involuntary minority groups view their situation as one of oppression rather than opportunity. In addition, a secondary frame of reference leads minority groups to see their distinctive language and cultural forms as central to their identities as minorities, rather than barriers to be overcome. These differences in both system forces and frame of reference lead to differences in community forces, which represent a group's collective response to their situation. And two aspects of this collective response of these community forces are said to be particularly deleterious to the minority educational achievement. First, a distrust of the attainment structure, and second, an ambivalence towards education. So according to Agbu, this is a quote, "Involuntary minorities do not believe strongly that the United States is a land of great opportunity where anyone who works hard and has a good education will succeed. Instead, they argue that the educational system is an avenue for success that is only available for white Americans. And this skepticism towards education as a way to advance economically, is said to shape what he calls students' educational strategies." One educational strategy that affects black students' achievement, according to Agbu, was outlined in an ethnography of an integrated suburban school system. In this study, Agbu argued that he observed few structural impediments to black achievement in this district and concluded the achievement gap persisted because black students were skeptical of education as a path to success, and this cynicism led minority students to expend less effort on schooling. Summing up his findings from this study, Agbu argued that the black students in this district were academically disengaged and, quote, did not work as hard as they should. Now this statement embodies the relationship between oppositional culture theory and this colorblind explanation of racial inequality more generally. The oppositional culture theory suggests that there are few structural impediments to success, and the problem remains because of dispositional characteristics and cultural deficits. Ambivalence towards education also is manifest in an attitude that he argues makes students see education as subtractive. That is, he argues that minority students may see a choice between working hard in school and maintaining their identity as a minority group member. And this aspect of the theory suggests that the adolescent peer culture among minority groups may be distinctively anti-academic. And this aspect of the theory has been widely reported on in the media as the, quote, acting white phenomenon. It has been a significant force in shaping the opinion of educators and educational administrators about the reasons for a persistent achievement gap. So when we sort of sum it all up, we can sort of distill a few empirical implications of oppositional culture theory. First, one of the empirical implications is that black students, more so than white students, will perceive barriers to status attainment. They will see race as a barrier to status attainment. Secondly, anti-school attitudes. Right? The theory argues or would suggest that black students should have more anti-school attitudes than their white counterparts. And finally, a lack of effort. They'll put forth less effort into their studies. And importantly, the theory suggests that accounting for these differences in attitudes and beliefs should shrink or should reduce or eliminate the achievement gap between black and white students. So that is Agbu's theory and some of the empirical implications. So next we'll sort of see what happens when the elegant theory is kind of ambushed by an ugly gang of data. Because of the prominence of this work in sociology and in social science more generally, it spawned a large body of empirical research that has sort of assessed different components of this theory. So we'll sort of go through some of the very generalized findings from this research in general. So first, the perceived barriers to status attainment, there is ample evidence that this part of the theory does pan out empirically. Almost every study that has looked at the issue has found that black students are more likely to reference racism and discrimination as barriers to status attainment. And this is also true among black Americans generally. If you look at public opinion research, ever since they really started collecting the data, most studies show that black students are in fact more likely to reference race and racism as barriers to their future success. So this is one part of the theory that sort of is supported. However, when we look at attitudes towards school, we start to see where the theory really can't account for most of the empirical patterns. The empirical evidence clearly indicates that black students have more pro-school beliefs and are more likely to embrace the achievement ideology than white students are. So, just a few of the research examples. A well-known study by Ainsworth, Darnell, and Downey in ASR found that black students had more pro-school attitudes and had ideals more consistent with the American achievement ethos. Another prominent author in this area is Angel Harris. In Angel Harris's research, he had 25 different attitudinal outcomes that he compared black and white students on. And to the extent that there were racial difference at all, he found that black students had more positive beliefs about status attainment. They had more positive affective responses towards schooling, meaning they said they liked school more. And they had ideals and values more consistent with the American achievement ethos. So he found little evidence of any sort of widespread oppositional culture in that study. So we might start to ask, how can black students, why would they simultaneously believe in racial barriers and also have these pro-school attitudes and believe in education as a pathway to success? Well, there's a growing body of research. Some of the more recent research suggests that student attitudes and beliefs can be very difficult to classify as either oppositional or pro-school. So for instance, research by Carla O'Connor at the University of Michigan documents the existence of what she calls co-narratives that modify the structure of the dominant ideology and incorporate alternate factors that might explain why any individual's ability to make it might be hampered. She argues that many high-achieving black students might recognize racial barriers to attainment and simultaneously believe that effort and achievement are the best ways to overcome these difficulties. And there's some other studies that have shown sort of a very similar thing. So when we look at this together, what we find is that not only does oppositional culture theory enable to explain just the general empirical pattern of black students having more pro-school attitudes, but the association or the relationship between seeing race as a barrier and having pro-school attitudes is the exact opposite of what the theory indicates. A number of studies indicate that those black students who are most likely to acknowledge the role of racism are also those students with the most positive attitudes towards schooling and the most dedicated towards working hard to overcome these barriers. So an ethnographic study by Sanders reported that exactly that the high-achieving students were more likely than their low-achieving counterparts to have a high awareness of racism and racial barriers. And in that study, again, she argued that Ogbu's perspective simply could not account for the degree to which recognition of racial barriers, high achievement, and positive school attitudes coexisted. So we see that the students most likely to acknowledge racial barriers also have the most pro-school attitudes, and they're also the highest achieving students. So none of these things can be sort of reconciled with the oppositional culture perspective. So to sum up the empirical evidence, there's little evidence of a pervasive oppositional culture among black students. And importantly, very importantly, when statistical studies, after you control for attitudes and beliefs, you actually see the achievement gap is larger than before you control for those beliefs. So that indicates that if black and white students had identical beliefs about school, beliefs about effort, beliefs about hard work, the racial achievement gap would in fact be larger than it is. So the black students' attitudes are actually a net benefit for their achievement. And again, completely the opposite of what the theory suggests. But for whatever reason, the oppositional culture perspective lives on. And very few new approaches or new conceptual ways of thinking about student attitudes and beliefs have been proposed to sort of try to account for these empirical patterns. So in this paper, I argue that the concept of black habitus, which comes from work by Moore, has the promise to sort of clarify the empirical patterns for student attitudes and beliefs. So just quickly, when we think about this concept of habitus, it's one of these sort of flighty concepts that, don't use it in a paper. It won't be criticized no matter what. But it's generally traced back to a theorist named Bourdieu's theoretical work when he attempted to integrate both objective and subjective understandings of social life. He argued that a focus only on subjective understandings, such as attitudes and beliefs, often overlooks important structural regularities that constrain individual action, yet may be unknown to social actors themselves. And conversely, a focus solely on objective regularities, such as the achievement gap, can ignore how actors interpret their lives and produce objective patterns in their day-to-day interactions. And given this emphasis on linking objective and subjective aspects of social life, this concept could have promise to understanding an issue like student attitudes and beliefs. So, as I mentioned in a 2008 paper, this woman, Kesha Moore, introduced this concept of what she called black habitus. Moore argues that the unique position of black Americans in U.S. history and their response to this position has led to a distinctive black habitus, and it differs markedly from the class-based habitus seen among working-class whites. Most of Bourdieu's stuff was about, well, it was about French people. So she outlines 3 dimensions of the black habitus which are particularly relevant to the current issue. First is a recognition of racial hierarchies as unjust. Second is a discourse of race and responsibility. And finally, strategies of action based on the field. So similar to the oppositional culture theory, this concept does indicate that you'll see a recognition of current racial hierarchies in the U.S. as a result of unjust barriers to social mobility. And as I mentioned before, I alluded to before, public opinion research dating back to the 1960s clearly shows that black and white Americans have different views about the role of race in status attainment. And black Americans are substantially more likely than whites to view racism, discrimination, and historical factors as important causes of racial inequality. And so this also can explain why we saw black students were more likely to acknowledge the effect of race and racism, and oftentimes are shown to have less self-efficacy than their white counterparts. Self-efficacy is defined as your belief that you can control your own destiny. The second aspect of the black habitus that Moore discusses is called the discourses of race and responsibility. She argues that in face of nefarious stereotypes that present them as inferior, black individuals feel like they're acting as representatives of the race in ways that white Americans do not. And she argues that this experience leads to a habitus that expresses morality and respectability as critical aspects of self-concept. In this idea that minority individuals have a specific role or a special responsibility to strive for success in the face of barriers has really been a central theme in the writings of black civil society leaders since the early 20th century. And while in contemporary American culture, this idea of authentic blackness is often associated with urban poverty and associated cultural forms, Moore argues that this notion, this erroneous notion, only intensifies the degree to which some black Americans feel that a critical part of their identity is a continued struggle for upward mobility. Another sort of piece of this evidence, if we go back even to the very early 20th century, before slavery had, well, right after slavery, we see that, during this time, discrimination was completely legal in the United States. And even at the time, if you look at sort of the most prominent works of black civil leaders, you don't see any oppositional, any evidence of an oppositional culture. In fact, many of the publications from prominent black organizations at the time utilized imagery and stories that embodied the classic American rags to riches theme. So for instance, the Southern Workman, an official publication of the Hampton Institute, was actually titled, its name was Progress, and it was filled with articles about progress, struggle, and upward climbs. So even in the early 20th century, in the face of widespread legal oppression, black Americans simultaneously both recognized racial inequality and advocated individual hard work and effort as the best ways to circumvent discrimination. The third aspect of the black habitus that's especially relevant for this issue is the idea that the manifestations can vary based on the social field or the social context. And this one is, I guess, less for more, but I argue that given the unique place of education in the history of black Americans, the black habitus is particularly relevant for understanding how black students might approach and understand educational pursuits. So throughout U.S. history, even under the regime of slavery, historical accounts indicate that black Americans pressed towards self-education despite legal prohibition and the risk of imprisonment, physical harm, or even death. There are many accounts of clandestine meetings in which self-taught members of the community would teach others reading, writing, and basic math. In the decades after slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, historically black colleges and universities were created as black leaders saw general education as critical first steps towards social advancement. You can look into the 20th century. Education was a central issue for the Niagara movement, which later became the NAACP. And even in more recent decades, many of the most notable and dramatic moments of the civil rights movement centered on educational access and equality. So in sum, there's overwhelming evidence that over the last 150 years, black Americans have equated success in education as a viable way to resist and overcome the adverse effects of racism and discrimination. And as Cross argues, the history of black Americans since emancipation can only be comprehended as a social movement for education. So, in sum, I argue that this concept of black habitus may be able to give us a more full understanding of racial differences in student attitudes and beliefs. So just some conclusions. First, I argue that a new approach is needed, an approach that can account for the empirical patterns. And I argue that starting from a different theoretical perspective can lead scholars to formulate new and different research approaches to understanding these beliefs. So rather than continuing this search for this oppositional culture that seemingly doesn't exist, scholars should try to develop ways to measure attitudes and beliefs that account for that duality and somewhat compromised or seemingly inconsistent beliefs that students might have. Secondly, this approach avoids the colorblind interpretations that are sort of central to the oppositional culture theory. And this isn't just sort of an academic issue, but this idea is now part of the law. The Parents Involved versus Seattle Public Schools was a Supreme Court case in 2007, obviously. And the parents involved were a group of mainly white parents who had sued the Seattle School District over an integration program that had been a long-standing program. And the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. It was kind of relitigating the civil rights law about school integration. And the Supreme Court argued or decided against the school district, and they said that the integration plan was illegal. And they essentially argued in there, sort of just embodying this colorblind approach, that there was no way to distinguish between the integration plan used in the Seattle system from school segregation in the 1950s. They said it's the exact same thing because we're in the post-racial era now. You can't discriminate. And they said this integrated plan was discriminating against white students. So it's also something that is very relevant for educational policy. And finally, the approach that I offer here really points back to socioeconomic disparities as the real cause of racial disparities in educational attainment. The evidence is seemingly overwhelming, although it's sort of an obvious explanation that really most of the achievement gap is due to socioeconomic disparities that, again, haven't really changed that much since the 1970s. So I think the last slide here. So this again just sort of shows how this oppositional culture theory has dominated the debate. This was a recent paper again by Doug Downey, and he said perhaps the main reason why scholars have doubted blacks' pro-school social attitudes is they've lacked a conceptual framework for understanding them. And so my hope is this line of work can perhaps provide or contribute to a new conceptual framework to understand these attitudes. Thank you.
Lots of time for questions.
Yes. Hi. My name is Robin Westman, and the question that I have, I'm a graduate student sociology program. The question that I have is that recently I read, and this was about a week, within the last 30 days, that there had been some research done that had said high-performing, low-income minority students are less likely to complete college than low-performing, high-income white students. Have you heard about that?
Not that specifically.
Okay. So I was kind of curious, does that kind of go along with what you're saying with well, it kind of contradicts what you're saying with respect to oppositional culture. There's the high performing, the desire from high school to go to college and to succeed, but because of the low income status, minorities are not succeeding as frequently.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's right. It goes back to the socioeconomic disparities as really the main underlying cause of these differences. I think it's always, you have to be careful when you start to look at achievement being sort of how well you do in school as an explanation for how far you go, because it's almost the same thing, right? So if you say, well, the reason that people aren't finishing college is because they don't achieve highly, I mean, you're basically just saying they're not successful in school.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you, by the way. And I'm in the English department. I'm a graduate teaching assistant in the English department, and my research is qualitative, but it's also on self-efficacy. And a lot of what my discipline in composition is interested right now in my department as well here is knowledge transfer and also writing assessment. And a lot of the recent work in writing assessment is concerned about dispositions because there's been sort of a blind eye toward it, because it's difficult to gauge these things in terms, or to consider them in writing assessment. But what I'm interested in here with my student population, I teach basic writing, which is the course that students test into before they can go into the intro course here, the 1010 course, and we have 43% of students who test into it. And while my research doesn't deal with race particularly, my classes are predominantly African American, and they're predominantly students who are local from, Detroit public schools. So it's been my experience, and this is just anecdotal at this point, that students do report that they are incredibly eager, and what they report is that they tell me things like, no one's ever cared before, no one's ever cared about my learning, no one's ever paid attention to it. So I'm interested in, we do a lot of reflective writing, and they talk a lot about their self-confidence and self-efficacy. So these things, we're attempting to do these things in writing assessment and in composition, and we're also looking for those frameworks. And a lot of the terminology in our discipline is ecological, bioecological models, things like that. So it is, just so you know, this is incredibly helpful, and we often look to sociology and look to educational psych to ground a lot of our work, because in composition for right now we have expressivist pedagogy where students write the self, there's a lot of I, and we want to get away from that and say students can consider the self in writing and not necessarily do expressivist writing. And so this is incredibly helpful, so thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think it's a good point where, you know, you were saying in the essays, and that was part of the thing, I didn't mention it, but in the paper, you know, another path for future research is if we acknowledge these positive beliefs and acknowledge them as genuine, then the question maybe becomes, you know, how do we create context where those positive beliefs can really be turned into achievement?
Absolutely.
And to be nurtured, right? Rather than, you know, I mean, a lot of the research, it just, they do a survey, they get the same finding every time, they say, well, they're just lying. Or, you know, something like that, so.
Yeah, we were trying to, like, my dissertation specifically is trying to figure out like, the pedagogy that fosters this or teaches to it explicitly. Yeah.
Thanks.
If in your research, for the term black, you substituted Jewish, Puerto Rican, or Latina, the term Latina suggests, of course, gender, would it be different for women? But those ethnic categories and gender, would you expect the results to be different?
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the big differences between what I'm trying to develop here and what Ogbu had argued. So Ogbu argued, again, that you just had to look at voluntary or involuntary minority and everything kind of flowed from there. And so this perspective really says you have to look more at the historical specificity of any group's experience, because we know that, you know, Native Americans, Jewish Americans, Hispanic Americans, they've all encountered different circumstances and they've had different experiences with racism and these racial projects. So I think, you know, you really have to look, I mean, even white Americans. White Americans, I mean, their privileged position in society has also led to, you know, this perspective would say a distinctive way of approaching things. So I think absolutely. You have to look at every group's experience and sort of, you know, to sort of understand how that would have led to their attitudes and beliefs currently.
Are there more recent studies than 2007? Because it's the fluctuation of students from high school and college that's like overflowing amount of young black people going to college than it used to be back then. So
Yeah, well,
studies showing
most of the studies, I should have mentioned this, most of the studies is high school population. And you know, given the lag before things actually get published, I think the latest empirical study cited in here is 2009. That was an ethnography, so she probably actually collected the data a few years before that. There's just a recent book by a lawyer, Stuart Buck, but it wasn't, there wasn't any new data collection or anything. Well,
I'm curious about something in Ogbu's study. Does he kind of, as he mentioned, he references as involuntary and voluntary status that these people have. Does he discuss, because when you talk about race, does he include, I don't know, black Americans that weren't part of this involuntary? I mean, because you talk about people that come here voluntary are latching to customs or language versus a minority status that they kind of are, you know, forced into. So like a black Arab from Sudan that comes for education, does he take that into account to kind of see if race really does play a part?
to some degree, he was actually an immigrant.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think that's part of it, you know, and so to some degree he does, but it's not a focus. I mean, he, as an anthropologist, right, he just is looking more at the broad culture. And so, I mean, obviously there's variability, but it's not something that he discusses so much. I mean, he definitely basically conflates race and the status as a voluntary or involuntary immigrant.
Right. It just makes more sense because involuntary Black Americans have faced lower socioeconomic. So just economic status just makes more sense than race itself. And it just feels like you should include something like that, comparing people that classify as Black, that have been here, that have roots tied to involuntary immigration versus ones that haven't.
Definitely, yeah, and I think, I mean, he would, and he did in some of his later work, say that, you know, he had been misinterpreted and you know, he wasn't focusing all on just the attitudes, but especially that ethnography from Shaker Heights, Ohio. That was his last big work, his last book. He's since passed, and if you read that one, I mean, it's pretty clear that he's saying it's student attitudes and effort. I mean, at one point in the book, he just says, you know, the reason that there's this racial gap in Shaker Heights is that black students just don't work hard enough. So that was sort of his final